Good evening, and thanks very much for that introduction, and it's wonderful to see such a wonderful turnout on a Monday evening, because I didn't choose the subject. It was again chosen by Quek. What treasures lie in Singapore waters? And as there are no reported treasures in Singapore waters whatsoever, this makes it a somewhat challenging topic. But I will endeavour to get somewhere. I've stolen his image from the promotional material because that illustrates wonderfully what the sort of dilemma we're up against when it comes to shipwrecks and treasures in Singapore waters. Let's see, where we've got a laser pointer, does that work? Yes. So this image that was provided on the advertising spiel, showing that beautiful stretch of coastline from Kallang Basin down to Changi, essentially everything in that image, everything on the land is reclaimed. So that makes it somewhat difficult to find all the shipwrecks, which increase in density as you get closer to the shore. And there are certainly wrecks that are findable in the archives, and to be in the archives, they're written up, they're stored, so therefore they're all the European ships that have come from the 16th century and beyond. And before that, you've got statistics, so the number of vessels travelling through Singapore waters. The fact that you've got the storms, you've got the reefs, sandbanks, pirates, battles, storms. So just from that pure volume of shipping, there's going to be a lot of shipwrecks in Singapore Strait. But as I've just said, they're under this reclaimed land. If you go back the other way, you get out towards Tuas. So there's Sultan Shoal was the western entrance to Singapore Strait. That used to be 5 nautical miles offshore. Now it's inside sheltered waters of the new Tuas port. Down on the far tip here, that's the Changi Naval Base. Back in the 80s, I used to go sailing out of Changi, and we used to race way out to sea around Seafix Buoy. That's now sort of within Changi Naval Base. So that shows to some extent the reclamation and the fact that the whole Kallang Basin area is potentially the old Singapore River port, and even right through to the 17th century when there's some artefacts that show up. And you have that huge density of shipping out there, so you can't even go out and survey. You can't use side scan, you can't use a magnetometer. So a big challenge in finding wrecks. So to find what might be out there, we actually have to determine what could be offshore by knowing what has been found onshore. And so there have been some archaeological digs done since the early 80s, and this image here is a colleague of mine, Lim Chen Xian. He's now with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. And this image is taken just after they completed the excavation at Empress Place. I think it was 2015. And in front of them, you have these magnificent ceramics, the Longchuan celadon, bowls, little bits of statuette. And there's Chen with his 2 lively assistants cradling very carefully a shitty old piece of wood. So these guys have their priorities right, because over here, and we can use some creativity here, this is the pit that they had at Empress Place, and that's a little wooden box. And they've dug a moat around it, and it's full of water. So, strictly speaking, this is a treasure in Singapore waters. And it's, I had the good fortune to be there on this day when they unearthed this. And it's a little wooden box. It might be the base of a well or a drainage system or a sewerage system, but you can't see it. Along the edge of this plank, there are holes, and those holes would have originally had wooden dowels through them. And when they pulled these pieces apart, the plank that was underneath also had dowel holes, but they weren't matching, and there were no dowels. So these timbers are more than likely from a Southeast Asian vessel where that dowel edge joining was a traditional technique. So that's the closest we've come to having a marine artefact, an archaeological artefact in Singapore. So let's try a little bit more, and we've got all these coins up the top here that they found on the site. We've got this beautiful big Longchuan charger, they call it, a large dish. And we have a bowl and various other artefacts. And lo and behold, if you go into a little out-of-the-way corner in the Asian Civilization Museum, you'll find this tiny collection, which is from the Nepa Shoal wreck. The Nepa Shoal shipwreck was found by a very old friend of mine, one of the oldest treasure hunters in the region, Captain Warren Blake. And he went out there with his yacht, 4 friends, and he, back in the days, I think it was early 80s, he was able to go to Nepa, which is actually in Indonesian waters, nobody was aware of treasure hunting in those days, so he just pretends to be fishing, and he puts his anchor down and he jumps over the side, swims along the bottom of the reef, and finds this beautiful big charger, just the same as the ones that were found at Empress Place. And he found about 20 of them, in fact, and a huge number of coins, thousands of Chinese coins. And he was there for just 2 days. He had 3 divers. They dived for the 3 days. They found everything they could within the sand. I think they were just hand fanning to bring everything up. They didn't have time to look for any hull remains, so he's got no idea what sort of a ship it was. And then on the end of the dive on the second day, his diver surfaced right under this creature, and they had to race him back into Singapore and send him to hospital for obvious reasons. So he never went back. He tried to get some funding together and some interest to go back out there, but because it was Indonesian waters and it was impossible to get a formal permit way back then, that was before they started issuing licenses, he never got back. So it's a very significant wreck. It's contemporary with Temasek, 14th century Singapore. That's Nepa Shoal, and it's just in Singapore waters. This line down here saying the ancient channel is essentially the Singapore-Indonesia maritime boundary. But the fact that it's over there implies that it was heading westward. It had already been through Singapore Strait. And if it was 14th century and Singapore was such a thriving port in the 14th century, the chances are that that vessel had stopped in at Temasek to trade, or perhaps it was a Chinese vessel that had come down with that cargo, had offloaded it in Temasek and had been loaded onto another ship. Could be Arab, could be Indian, could be Southeast Asian, to carry on to India, the Middle East, where you find a lot of this large Longchuan celadon. We don't know, and we never will know, because Nepa Shoal went from that's the natural Nepa Shoal, and Indonesia's done a little bit of a China in the South China Sea, and has done this fantastic bit of reclamation all over Nepa Shoal. It's now forested. There is still a chance there's something there, because it seems they put a seawall, and if not too much sediment's gone down, you might actually be able to find something. So if it's ever possible to get a license in Indonesia again, and I can twist Warren's arm, it might be worth having another look. So we go back to the land sites in Singapore once again to see what's potentially out there, and this doesn't look very impressive. I mean, I'm here to talk about treasure for an archaeologist. The treasure could be a human tooth, it could be shards like this, but I think with this more general audience, we can actually regard treasure, as most people do, as something of high commercial value as well as high archaeological value. So these shards are UN blue and white. This is the first commercially viable quantities of ceramics, blue and white ceramics, that were ever exported from China. They're all from Jingtachin. The blue is a cobalt that was imported from Persia, so obviously very high costs involved, and it was an extremely thriving business for a very short time, just through the middle of the 14th century. And we have those nice pieces in Singapore on the land, in Traulan in eastern Java. That was the capital of the Majapahit kingdom in the 14th century. There's a lot of this material. There's only one wreck being reported up near China in the Paracels. The Chinese archaeologists were out there, and they got very excited because they recovered these 3 little bowl bases. So it shows how significant this UN blue and white is. But in terms of commercial value, you think those little shards are nothing? This bowl base, which is probably looted from Traulan, it's been offered on eBay for 500 US. A little shard like that. And this quite superb example of a bowl sold at Sotheby's for £112,000, 200,000 Singapore dollars. So that's genuine treasure, and you're going to get a lot of people, legal or illegal, trying to go out there and find material like this. And here we go. This is genuine treasure again, also from Fort Canning. There was a group of labourers working on a reservoir in Fort Canning in 1928, and as they were digging down, they found this gold jewellery. This is in the National Museum. There were other pieces as well, but they seem to have gone missing, as treasures tend to do over time. And this has been ascribed to Majapahit style and era, the gold jewellery that was recovered. And they augmented that collection with some other pieces that were said to be Majapahit, and may well be. So that Naga clasp here on that shiny chain was in the museum as a sort of a contemporary piece with the other pieces they'd excavated from Fort Canning. The piece next to it is remarkably similar. It's a naga, and it comes from a slightly different origin. This is from a shipwreck called the Earthenware, and it's 10th century. So either that design has been around for a long, long time with minimal change, or that piece on the left is far older than people think. So it's worth looking a little bit more at the Earthenware. It's not directly related to Singapore. It never voyaged through Singapore Strait, but as I'll show in a sec, there are some elements of the cargo that are quite relevant. So I worked on this, I can't remember, a long time ago, before the Belitung wreck, so it must have been mid-90s. And we stayed for 3 months on that beautiful, luxurious fishing boat there, resupplied with vegetables and sort of rancid bean curd every now and then, and otherwise lived off rice and the fish we caught under the boat. But it was a magnificent sight, and a phenomenal range of artifacts we recovered there, all from around the mid-10th century. So the ceramics, there were about 8,000 individual ceramic items that we recovered. That's the recovery process, and here are some of the pieces. So it's mostly ware from southern China. Very nice pieces, and certainly that pillow at the bottom, and it's a bird whistle at the top. The spouts on the jars, they made a nice little phoenix. So very creative people, the potters in the ware kilns. And we also got this amazing range of non-ceramic artifacts. So these are all religious artifacts. So you've got a votive tablet mold, bodhisattva here, kakara, all these bells. So these things are both Hindu and Buddhist, so a nice combination. They coexisted very much in the 10th century. And of course, we've got to get some real treasure in there. So apart from the mirrors and the kala head, we had silver ingots. So the silver ingots had actually been smuggled on board or illegally exported from China because the characters on them specify that it's a tax, it's a salt tax. So they were all smuggled out and sent down towards Indonesia. And of course, you've got to have some real treasures. These rings, so they're spectacular, very heavy, some set with rubies and amethyst. It's a rock crystal on the bottom. Some seem to have been just symbolic. That one on the bottom right is too small to put on a finger. But they have those script, so they could be used as a stamp, a seal, as well as being worn on a hand. And a nice big gold parasol handle. The one on the right is a chupping, a modesty cover for a child, a kris handle in the middle, and that disc, we don't know what the disc was used for. And for this discussion, all of those gold things we can regard, and for the Javanese, of course, in the 10th century, those are just mere baubles. This is a treasure for the Javanese. This stuff which hasn't fared so well underwater, but over here is tin, 99.99% tin. There's a chunk of lead. This is copper. We've actually got chunks of statues, bronze statues, that have been hacked apart, and the chunks of bronze have been sent to Java as a raw material. Reason being is that Java has no commercial quantities of metal, so everything had to be imported. So that was a very valuable bit of information in determining what this ship was doing. It was a Southeast Asian ship. There was hardly anything left of the hull, but for some small bits of wood with wooden dowel holes in them. So that was the evidence, plus the fact that we had some identification of the timber species. So she wrecked up there between Bangka and Jakarta. She had been trading almost certainly with Palembang. So we had all the Chinese ceramics, but the ceramics were loaded on top of the tin. And Bangka and Belitung, which are now the world's biggest producers of tin, weren't producing in the 10th century. All that tin came from Kedah in Malaysia. So the tin had been brought down through Singapore Strait to get down to Palembang to carry on towards Eastern Java on the Intan wreck. So that is something that could potentially be. So we're pushing things a little bit, but you could have a tin cargo in Singapore Strait. You could also have cargoes of glass. This glass has been identified through chemical analysis as coming from the Middle East. The Chinese also made glass in the 10th century, but this is Middle Eastern. And those little glass beads were probably locally produced in Sumatra using the raw glass that was brought in from the Middle East. So we got a lot of, essentially everything was broken except for that one bottle, but there was a vastly more bottle bases. So The glass could have also been sent in as scrap glass just for remelting. That went through Singapore Strait, and interestingly, there's this few shards here that have the turquoise glaze. Very clearly, these are amphora from the Middle East, from Persia or Iraq. So the vessel that could have been bringing that glass and these amphora and possibly even the tin could have been an Arab ship. It could have been a later version of the Belitung wreck. So all sorts of interesting ships. It could have been an Indian ship, of course, all sorts of interrelated trade coming through. And then you have these other turquoise glazed amphora, also from Persia or Iraq, on a different ship altogether. And these are from the famed Tung ship or the Belitung ship, and that's the replica of it. The replica is a very accurate version, I believe. It's based completely on the hull remains that we recorded. It was a ship excavation that was done back in 1998-99, and it was fully buried, so it was an amazing amount of hull remains there. So we managed to record everything, and we worked with a naval architect, and eventually the Omani government built this thing using traditional techniques, and they sailed it back to Singapore. And this is the wreck site itself. That's just one of the big Dusun-type jars. That's the location of the wreck, just off Belitung Island. Again, nowhere near Singapore Strait at this time, but she had very clearly gone through Singapore Strait on the way up to China. She'd gone from the Middle East, went up to China, fully traded there. The entire cargo is Chinese ceramics and Chinese artifacts, including some very valuable pieces. And then she came back down. Typically, she'd go back down, possibly go to Palembang before going back through Singapore Strait. In this instance, she's gone much further south, so it's very hard to determine exactly what the route was. This is unusual to be down there. It's possible she was going to go through Sunda Strait, but there's very little documentation on anyone using Sunda Strait at that time. She could have been just trading with an outpost at Sriwijaya and then head back up through Singapore Strait. These guys didn't consider time the way we consider time these days. They had time on their hands. They were in no great hurry. Back on the same vessel, the same boat we used on the Intan, this one was much closer to shore, only a mile offshore, only 17 meters deep, so it was a lot of fun diving down there and scraping away at the bottom, seeming to achieve almost nothing until, bingo, just below the surface, hundreds of Changsha bowls. So they were stacked in these rows, some of the rows cross ships, some of them thwart ships, and they were originally in straw cylinders. The straws all rotted away. But we also got all these big jars, and so most of these jars were probably used for liquids or foodstuffs which have disappeared. But some of the jars held far more valuable cargo. So that one on the right had a existing crack, a pre-existing crack. We didn't do that. We gently placed it on the deck, and then the top half rolled away to reveal the packing method inside. So they'd put up to 140 of these bowls inside one jar. And when they came out of those jars, they were in absolute pristine condition, because the jars would fill up very early with a fine sediment, so there's no oxygen to degrade the glaze. So in many cases, the glaze on these bowls is better than the bowls that have never gone under the sea. They've been passed down as heirlooms, they've been found in tombs. So this is about as good as they get. And of course, there's many different types of ceramics. That large vase on the right, that's nearly a metre high. The centerpiece, that's a spectacular piece. So we talked earlier of the UN blue and white with the blue from Persia. This too had blue from Persia. And these being in the middle of the 9th century, the wreck is dated 826, by the way, from a stamp from etching into the side of a bowl. These are the oldest intact blue and white ceramics ever found anywhere in the world, and they're sitting right here in the ACM. And of course we have more treasures, the Chinese mirror. Some of the mirrors were antiques when they were found on the 9th century wreck. They dated well before the wreck itself. And the silver-covered boxes, typically with these pairs. There's a pair of birds, there's a pair of goats, which has led people to speculate that maybe they were intended as a gift from the emperor in Japan to a sultan in the Middle East, or to a newly married couple. And it's a inkstone on the bottom with wear marks, so that was potentially being used by a merchant on board. And there's the epitome of treasures. These beautiful gold pieces, in my opinion, polished up perhaps a little bit too much. It doesn't look like it came from a shipwreck at all. But they're truly superb. The cup, there's been one found before in China in a tomb site, but this one's the biggest that's ever been found. And these dishes and bowls that went with it. Unfortunately, they were all coming up in 1998. I just directed the 1999 season, so I didn't get to recover them, but I also didn't get the hassle of dealing with the security and what have you that went with them. But we have them all now in the Asian Civilization Museum. They were purchased by a private philanthropist and donated for the price of $32 million. So that's a terrific cargo, but it's finally on exhibit. It was going to do international touring. That was stopped for a while, but now it's back in full swing, which is good to see. And in the middle of it, there's a magnificent model of the dhow. And that model was hand-stitched by the same guy that helped do the design. He's a guy called Nick Birmingham. He's down in Fremantle. So he built that model because they couldn't obviously put the whole replica in the ACM. But they could put it in the Resorts World Maritime Experiential Museum on Sentosa. So that's really right now the only real artifact in that museum. It's a superb thing. It's not really covered very well there. Otherwise, it's very much a children's museum for showing trade in the region. They've recently revamped it, and unfortunately, a very important cargo which they still own, I believe, and was on display, has disappeared from the gallery. And this is the Bakau wreck. We excavated the Bakau wreck immediately after the Belitung wreck, and it's just to the east of Belitung Island. And it's very important because it's the only wreck, well, there's actually one other, but it hasn't been fully excavated, that is contemporary with Tsinghua. So it's wrecked in the early 15th century. And it had many treasures on board. It was highly looted when we got there, but it still had these silver ewers, the Longchuan ceramics. So it was a very important site, and a very nice site to work, I might add. That's the reef where she was lost. So our front anchor line just goes down to the wreck location on the edge of that reef. And despite the looting, we still found quite a lot of material. So the looters hadn't been able to lift these big jars. So these are Thai storage jars, and they'd been carrying foodstuffs. So there were a few that had some seeds and things left in them. But underneath was quite a lot of the ship's structure. So we actually excavated the sand, and that's a mosaic there that shows the stern, I believe, of a Chinese junk. And there's no keel. So this is I think the first evidence that there were ever Chinese junks with a flat bottom that voyaged south from China. The flat bottom vessels were used all the time in the coastal region and the estuaries and the rivers. But typically in the south of China, they had a V-shaped bottom, and that was probably adopted from Southeast Asian ships. The Chinese didn't start voyaging themselves until about the 12th century. So this is a great Chinese junk. It wasn't, of course, trading in Singapore Strait, but it was a vessel that was contemporary with Tsinghua, and therefore there could have been other ships very similar to this with the same sort of cargo. And this is the time when Malacca is established. So they could have been going through Singapore Strait on the way to Malacca. And that's another view of some of the cargo. There's Southeast Asian earthenware. This is fine paste ware from Thailand, Longchuan Celadon. So there's a wide range of material. So she could have been almost like a tramp steamer, just going from China down to Thailand, down to Indonesia, stopping on the way to trade. And that's probably what she looked like. So this is a model that was also made by Nick Birmingham, the same guy that did the Tongue wreck. So that's going through till the early 15th century, and so we've had a little bit of a leap here, and this is going to a time when the Portuguese have arrived. So things start to change a little bit. This is a great painting, and it's Changi. It's out at Changi Point. And they've got north around the wrong way, but north is that way. This is Pulau Tekong. There's old Changi Point before they put the naval base, which is way out here somewhere. And it's a Portuguese guy. He's a very gung-ho admiral, Admiral Coutinho. And he's fighting the Achinese here, quite successfully. So they've got his one big boat, and he's surrounded by all these little galleons, or galleys, the rowing craft. So that was a battle there. So there's a good chance, there's no recording of any Portuguese vessels being lost in this particular battle, but there's a very good chance there's Chinese vessels lost, and they're now under Changi Terminal 3, 4, or 5. I just digress a little bit here because this admiral's quite a character. He went from that battle and he drifted around for another 6 years, and then in 1583 we got another depiction of him, and this time he's completely on his own. He's heard that the Chinese are raiding Malacca, Portuguese-held Malacca. So he decided he'd come up here and fight them off single-handed. And this is Pulau Jawa here, where the Portuguese had a small fort. Malacca itself, so they're sort of trying to help him out, but here he is, and there's a very detailed description of this battle. And apparently a cannonball got into his ship and it ignited the gunpowder in the powder room, and it blew the stern off the ship. Killed a lot of people, but it didn't kill our great admiral. He was captured by the Chinese. Now I went back there, I actually managed to get a survey license for the federal waters in Malaysia, not the state waters, so I had to look everything beyond the 3 nautical mile range. And I was there on statistics, just as you could do in Singapore Strait. The amount of shipping that was going to and fro from Malacca warranted a full blanket survey. I didn't have any specific wreck in mind. I just went out there and looked. So I found a submarine out there, the stratagems out there, and then a little closer inshore, I came across this fantastic cannon. So that's it's about a 3-meter cannon. It's got these lifting rings on it. So the lifting rings were only used in the very earliest cannons. After that, they put what's called a dolphin. So it's cast in in the shape of a dolphin for lifting them on and off the ship. So that dated it immediately. And then you've got the armillary sphere there, which only the Portuguese put on their cannons. So we've got a Portuguese ship, 16th century. There was a smaller cannon there, buried under the ballast stones. Digged a little bit more. There's these bones that were foodstuffs for the crew. There was that nice little jar there guarded by the crab. That was his home. I actually put it upright and kicked him out of his home. And a few shards. So these shards are important more for their archaeological purpose than commercial, but they're cracked ceramics. So again, they date it to the late 16th century. So I think there's a very good chance that vessel is actually Admiral Coutinho's ship, and it's the position that's given in all the descriptions is exactly right, between various islands. Unfortunately, nothing was done about the salvage of that because they established a heritage department in Malaysia just after I found it, and it was headed by a lady who was very terrestrial, xenophobic. So I never had my license cancelled, but I also didn't get it renewed. And so that vessel still sits out there, and it's in an anchorage that's used by all the cruise ships that come down. So I'd say there's a good chance that an anchor from a cruise ship has now gone right through the middle of that very important, historically important wreck. But I'll carry on with these beautiful diagrams. So there's our admiral, and they shipped him up to Aceh itself. They had him under arrest in Aceh, and he got word of the fact that they were probably going to execute him, so he escaped, but was foolish enough to cut off the trunk of an elephant in his escape, which sort of pissed them off. And then the next image shows that they've adopted a North Korea-style execution technique, and they killed him with a cannon. No, they weren't mucking around. But at the same time, they look pretty happy. The executioner and the executioned are quite pleased with this scenario, it seems. So that's a little foray into Malaysia. So we get back to, this is Changi Point again. This is a very famous illustration of the Battle of the Dutch and the Portuguese off Johor, off the Johor River. So there's all these people, the Chinese are back, the Johorians are there, so it's a big battle. There's, again, no recorded loss of a European ship, but there must be European ships lost in Singapore waters. So just as another quick aside, I'll go back to Malacca. During my blanket survey, I had a very antiquated digital side-scan sonar. In fact, it was back there in that image of the museum on Sentosa. I donated it to the museum there. And that's also disappeared. But anyway, so there's the image, and I sort of looked at it, looked like a reef, but I was diving on everything that showed up. Otherwise, it was just a flat, sandy bottom, so it was well worth inspecting everything. But it wasn't a reef. It turned out to be another old wreck, probably late 16th century. In fact, two wrecks. They were tied side by side. So they'd been, I think, either the Portuguese or the Dutch had captured two vessels. They'd emptied off virtually all the cargo, tied them together, and burned them. So the only thing we found was that there's a charred timber, and this is right at the base of the vessel, so she definitely burnt. And these are stone cannonballs. So the only dating I can do, the only other artifact of significance was a fishhook. So I've got stone cannonballs and a fishhook, but it's pretty well certain that's also a late 16th century wreck. Also still sitting out there, not quite so vulnerable to the ship's anchoring. So that one might be worth following up if ever licensing in Malaysia eases up a little bit. Now, back to Singapore. Now, this is a very fascinating period. There's quite a lot of study being done on Temasek, and a lot of material showed up in Fort Canning and Empress Place and the Padang, St Andrews. So this is in the Kallang River in the basin when it was being dredged. This is the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And a dredger, probably a Dutchman, and no doubt there's one or two here, was very fortunate in finding quite a lot of blue and white porcelain while he was dredging. And of course, there was no regulations whatsoever. He donated a few shards to the museum in Singapore and took the intact or near intact pieces home. So I don't know if there's any recording of what they were, but this is very clearly early 17th century blue and white ceramics from China, at a time when now they're using cobalt that they sourced in China. They don't have to get it from Persia anymore. Those two pieces on the left are also from Kallang Basin. They're dredged up, and they've got this beautiful theme of the birds flying around that central medallion, which rekindled a memory of another wreck that I excavated, which also has those three birds flying around the center. Very different type of ceramic. These ones are from Jingtachin, although they're quite crude. They may not actually be from Jingtachin. This one's from Changzhou, which is in the south of Fujian province. And this is a kiln which only produced ceramics from about 1550 to 1650. And it's very crude, it's very naturally painted, but underneath it, they put these ceramics in the kiln on the sand. So when they fired it, and the glaze is still wet, all the kiln sand adhered to the base. So this is not something that appealed to the Europeans. They had their beautiful polished tables. They didn't want to be putting this stuff on their polished tables. But the Southeast Asians, who were still often eating on the ground, had no problem with a plate like that. It's a huge plate, so it's great for communal eating. And so it's worth taking a little bit of a look at this wreck. This is up in Vietnam. And I worked with my old buddy Warren Blake, who found the Nepa Shoal wreck, and we got a license to go surveying in Vietnam many, many years ago around Holland Bank. And this time, we're sort of looking for wrecks that were researched, but we're also looking for anything that came down from China on the northeast monsoon, hit this bank, and then just carried on. The ideal scenario for in this audience, I can use the word treasure hunter, to have a vessel that's holed and carries on and then sinks in deeper water, so it's completely protected, covered in sand, and nobody finds it. So when you get to dive on it, it's not all smashed up because it's been in a shallow reef. The storms haven't been damaging it. So we surveyed out to about 3-4 miles from the bank. And we found that nice big European anchor up on top of the bank, but we didn't find anything else. But the Vietnamese, years later, they had sympathy on me and my efforts out there. That's obviously just 1 or 2 years ago, you can see from that photograph. And they called up and said, "We've found your wreck." And I said, "What do you mean, you found my wreck?" And it turned out that fishermen had been trawling out there, and they'd got their net entangled, and they'd gone down to clear it, and the whole seabed was covered in blue and white porcelain. And it was 5 miles out. So if I'd carried on another 2 miles, then I would have had that way before. So they actually invited me to go in there and have a look at it. So I went out with the Navy, and that was the site that greeted us on the first survey dive. Everything was pretty well smashed up. The looters had been there. The fishermen obviously knew the value of the ceramics, so it's much better to go and recover ceramics than recover fish. And they had a good go at it, but they were caught. Here they got 2 stonefish are guarding the site. So we had a bit of an issue with the stonefish out there. But with a little bit of a dig around, there were still these great big stacks of dishes. Unfortunately, you can see there, the edge has knocked off all those dishes. So that I've put upright, but that was on its side. So that's what happens when trawl nets go over old shipwrecks. And that's one of the biggest problems in Southeast Asia now. Apart from all the looting, things that are not looted are just destroyed by the trawlers. So we're not doing that well out there. Anyway, I went off and we negotiated. It took us a year before we got a contract to go in there and excavate. They did have a patrol boat on the site to guard it, but they couldn't be there all the time, so obviously a bit more looting was going on. But we dug down, and it was worth digging because there was a massive ceramics in the bottom of the hold. That's actually the foremast. And then on either side, there's two wooden beams there. They're called tabernacle partners, so it was a Chinese junk, very clearly a Chinese junk, many other characteristics typical of a Chinese junk. And this great collection of junk Schaal, exclusively junk Schaal, blue and white. And if you look at the bowl there, which looks quite rubbish, they were actually more exciting originally. They were covered with a overglaze enamel, and they were bright greens and blues and reds. Unfortunately, because it's overglaze, it's been eroded away by the sea and the oxygenation. The blue and white, the blue is beneath the glaze, so it's protected. So we had a wonderful time excavating all that. We got down to the other main cargo, which is iron. And this is sort of, doesn't get much attention, but almost all the ships coming down from China with cargoes of ceramics also have a huge cargo of iron. This is cast iron, these are woks, they're the handles in fact, and they all concrete together, it's like a reef, and you can't move them. So I couldn't record the middle of this ship, it was impossible to remove the iron. It's also impossible to conserve it, so there's not much point bringing it up. So we had some rare calm days, that's one of them, and brought up our baskets of ceramics with these beautiful little, they look like egg cups, but these are wine cups. They're white here, but they originally would have had these vibrant colours on the top too, and the blue and white little jarlets. That's just a typical load that was in a basket that came up. We had many baskets coming up during the day, so everything was washed. Very little marine growth because most of it's covered in sediment, and they are all catalogued, computer catalogued, and then packed away in a container. And there were some treasures indeed on this one. Even though it's a lower quality ceramic, the bulk of the blue and white had this twin phoenix design, but we got all sorts of unique designs. So we'd go searching through the contents of the basket every day, and you get things like this warrior on horseback, this beautiful set of dishes. In one case, it's just a floral design, and then you've got the immortals on the other one. And this is interesting because there's a very clear Dutch description in the 17th century, which orders precisely this type of ceramic for curiosities for the Dutch market. So we found some on this vessel, along with various other weird and wonderful ceramic types. That one in the middle is not jink to jint, but it's so fine that you hang it up or hold it up to the sun and put your hand behind it. You can very clearly see your fingers through the porcelain. That's the hull, Chinese junk. You've got the bulkheads there, the frames, and the very interesting thing about this one is that it was a Chinese junk, which is almost impossible to get any research information. There's no archives that we know of in China. Everything was dealt with by private merchants. But the Europeans had the big trading companies, the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company. So you can go and get a lot of material in The Hague. And I had a researcher in The Hague, and he was going through the records after we found this, looking for something of that period, and he came up with these documents which are called cedula. And the Dutch arrived in the late 16th century in Southeast Asia. They didn't establish Batavia until 1619, but they spread out. They went to Patani, they went to Johor, they went to Macau, everywhere that the Dutch hadn't, the Portuguese hadn't established themselves. And they dealt with the Malays, they dealt with the Chinese merchants and the captains, and very quickly established this great system of trust. So they would come and trade in the mirrors and glass that they bring from Holland. Very little else they actually had that was appealing to the Chinese. A large part of this trade in the Changchou ceramics was because the Southeast Asians loved the stuff. The Dutch weren't interested, and they bought it so they could use it for the Inter-Asian trade to get spices. So you've got these documents, and this one here is not dealing with the ship itself, but it's signed, it's written in Dutch, and it's signed in Arabic and Chinese. So it's a fantastic document. But there was another similar one from a gentleman by the name of Abraham van den Broek in Johor. And he'd signed one of these with a merchant named Isin Ho, and he was to bring a shipload of raw silk down from China back to Johor, along with other Chinese goods. And in 1608, there's a record that his vessel, along with the silk and the Chinese goods, was lost off Cambodia, 1608. So Cambodia, this is Vietnam, but when you look at the old French charts, southern Vietnam is Cambodia in that time. So I think there's a very good chance that the Binh Tuan wreck is actually Isin Ho's vessel. And it was headed for Johor. And if you look at this 1604 chart, there's Singapore, there's the Johor River. Again, this is a about face, so north is up here. And here's the Shah Bandaraya, the famous thing. Peter Borschberg talks about it all the time, John Mexick also. So Singapore was a significant port in the 17th century. And those blue and white ceramics from the Kallang Basin attest to that. And Johor, the Sultan of Johor, that's his Shah Bandaraya. Singapore was part of Johor, so there's far from being a certainty, but there is a very good chance that the Binh Tuan ship and its cargo of Changchal ceramics were bound for Singapore. So that's one of the most relevant. And there's the famous painting, it's in the Asian Civilization Museum, of Chinese junks off Singapore. There's Fort Canning up here. But if you can imagine that boat full of rowing Europeans disappearing and these buildings disappearing, you'd have exactly the same scene in 17th century Singapore. In fact, you'd have the same scene in 14th century Singapore. Chinese junks changed very little in design over the hundreds of years. And there's a very good chance there's plenty of them in these waters. So going from all this speculation, we can have a quick look at what is actually there. And to do that, all you have to do is go downstairs, and you can find the Straits Times, you can find the Singapore Free Press, and you can find the Penang Gazette, which go back and very detailed descriptions of ship losses, collisions, a lot of collisions, a lot of losses on reefs. So this is just one example, and it's the Zara and the Labuan. The Labuan was a screw steamer, and the Zara was a bark. And this is on tiny writing on mine. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a great description in the paper that at the inquest, the steamer's bowsprit struck the mainmast of the bark and snapped right across, the upper portion of the mainmast falling down the main hatchway and passing clear through her bottom. So it was a very dramatic collision, and she sunk because a hole was punched in the bottom of the ship by the mast. And these are the type of ships they would have been. This is a screw steamer, this is a bark, and there's the, I didn't show before, the 12,300 reals of treasure, which was silver coins. So they're sitting down there within 1 mile of Raffles Lighthouse. So it could have sort of encroached across the Indonesian side, perhaps not, probably not, but it's under one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. So the only way you're going to get down there and find that one is in a mini submarine. So anyone that's brave enough to drive their mini submarine underneath all the VLCCs going at 25 knots in Singapore Strait, you're welcome. Won't be me. Okay, so this is another very interesting chunk of Singapore waters, and we have to go all the way out here to Pedra Branca. Now, I applied for a license to go surveying around Pedra Branca in 1992. I was a little bit ahead of my time. The National Heritage Board didn't know quite what to do with an application from a private company, and soon after I applied, the Malaysian government decided they wanted a piece of Pedra Branca too. So I was put to the side while that was sorted out. So that went from 1992 until 2018, when Mahathir very generously withdrew the latest appeal to acquire that rock. And so after all those years, Singapore now is the owner of that rock. There's no disputing and there's no changing that situation. The only thing that's still in question is the line between Malaysia and Singapore. So Middle Rocks is only 900 metres away, and they have to determine between themselves what the dividing line is, and that still hasn't been done. And there's South Ledge also, another issue. So this has been claiming wrecks for 2,000 years at least, up till very recently. This is 2015, and that's a very dramatic image of a barge that was being towed towards eastern Malaysia, and the tow rope snapped in the northeast monsoon, and she drifted back onto Pedra Branca with those two container cranes, which were deck cargo on the barge, and they started heeling over with a real chance that they was going to topple onto the famous Horsburgh Lighthouse, built in 1851. And so it was a very urgent salvage project where they went out there, and instead of trying to pull the thing off and get rid of it, they just put dynamite on the platforms and 2 big supply boats, pulling them offshore, and blew them up and pulled them away from the lighthouse. So it's quite a great effort to save the lighthouse, but in doing so, they made it a much harder salvage effort. So the guys that had to go back out there and bring it all off the reef had a lot more work to do and earned a lot more money from it. But she'd claimed others. So back in 1979, there's a ship up on the rocks just to the east of the lighthouse. And this is despite the navigation aid and radar and all these good things. So she's still quite a danger. And you go back to when the Dutch first arrived. This is a famous passage from Lin Schoten, worth reading. From the Cape of Singapore to the hook named Sinosora, which is Lima Channel, to the east, 18 miles, 6 or 7 from thence, layeth a cliff in ye sea called Pedro Bianc, where the ships that come and go from China do oftentimes pass in great danger, and some are left upon it. I say more than some. So she's clearly a great danger there before the lighthouse. And this is a little text from Horsburgh that the lighthouse is named after. So the image there is a very calm day, but it of course is an image after this text was written. It was 1809. And it just shows one of the other reasons that ships go up there. So the Schaal chart is definitely, or was definitely, lost on Pedro Branca. And she was trying to tack, and this beautiful calm day, and she couldn't get all the way around. So while essentially she's caught in irons or in stays. And so she just drifted without any steerage while they tried to get the sails backwinded to get enough motion to regain steerage. And before they could do that, she was just piled onto the rocks by the current. And the current out there is vicious. So that's another victim, and another way that victims, or they occur. And this was written as a bit of a summary, and it states the important one there is between 1824 and 1851, 16 large vessels were totally lost there. And it states a couple of those in the cargo on board. Now you've got to be a little careful with these, because when they state a broad statement like that, doesn't necessarily mean it's lost on Pedro Branca. It could also be on Middle Rocks, could be on South Ledge, and both of those tend to be far more dangerous because they're underwater. At high tide, they're completely underwater. Or in fact, it could be down on the northeast tip of Bintan. So there's a series of reefs out there that have claimed many wrecks. So when you read in the paper that a ship's lost on Pedro Branca, sometimes it's just in the region of Pedro Branca. But anyway, so we've gone through with much speculation, possibilities, and some reality. But what do we have to show for all that after all these years? And Singapore being essentially a maritime port right up to the 20th century. Singapore has been a maritime port, the main reason for being here. So the last image is of the Singapore Maritime Museum. And there isn't one. So I would like to contribute to the Maritime Museum that soon will be, I hope. Thank you.